Hello there. Today we are going to be delving into one sick individual and his case, where it was reported that he would commit acts of necrophilia and would occasionally cannibalize parts of his victims. Francisco Garcia Escalero from Madrid, Spain, would go on to commit some of that region's most sick and disturbing murders of their time. With the number of confirmed victims resting at well over 11, his methods would display a demented and insane monster. By means of stabbings, arson, and his favorite way of killing, by crushing people's heads in with a large stone, Francisco would always leave a bloody, disturbing scene. Born on May 24, 1948, Francisco always seemed to be a sick little boy and simply looked strange most of the time. Due to this and a poor upbringing where his father was mentioned as completely hating him and possibly mistreating him as well, although these allegations are unconfirmed. Francisco suffered from ill health since an early age and received a very little to no education at all. Even as a small child, Francisco would display a pathological fixation with death. He would spend most of his time playing in the neighboring cemetery and would often gamble with his own mortality, as he enjoyed walking in front of moving cars for the thrill of it. Some reports state that he would often hurt himself in many ways. Francisco would begin to show signs of mental issues from an early age, as one of his hobbies would be to snoop around people's windows holding a knife until he would find either single women or couples that were naked. He would then proceed to pleasure himself through the darkness in their window. Francisco would suffer from daily delusions where he believed his childhood neighbors were always talking about him behind his back. Allegedly, with very little support from his family, Francisco had no choice but to begin stealing, robbing, and even begging on the street to survive since the age of 16. Although some reports state that he had left his home willfully at the age of 14, where he would begin to drink up to a bottle of liquor a day. In 1973, Francisco would be committed as he was caught stealing a motorcycle and would be sent to a reformatory school where he was allegedly mistreated there. Only 3 years after this ordeal did Francisco commit his first heinous crime, where he and one of his unnamed friends would go on and commit sex crimes to a young woman while her boyfriend was made to watch. After this attack, Francisco would be sentenced to a 12-year prison where he would do hard time. Although in prison, Francisco's fascination with death would not end while he was incarcerated. Cellmates and guards were quoted as stating that Francisco would spend most of his time caretaking for several dead pigeons and animals which he would find around the facility. Once released from prison, there would be a small glimpse of hope that Francisco could reform, as he moved back into his father's home, where he began to take care of him as he had become bedridden while Francisco was away completing his time. Throughout the next couple of years, Francisco finally began to have his own goals and aspirations, as he mentioned wanting to become a bus driver and would keep a punctual schedule in aiding his father. But even then, when everything seemed to be going as best as it could, did Francisco begin to show signs of a declining mental stability. It first began as some minor lapse in memory, then in judgment. Francisco would be seen staring off into the distance as he pondered his next move, completely forgetting he was out doing chores. Alienating his only few friends and family that he had left, he was left with very little support. Things only turned for the worst once his father passed away, and with Francisco's deteriorating mental stability, he would lose the home and become a street beggar once again. In the years spanning between 1987 and 1994, Francisco would be known as the Beggar serial killer of Madrid, Spain. Plagued and disturbed by the voices in his head, Francisco would go on to murder his first victim only 3 years after his initial release. On the 11th of November 1987, a sex worker named Paola Martinez would unfortunately meet her ultimate demise at the hands of Francisco. Sex workers and beggars would be an easy target for Francisco, and as such, that faithful night, he would head out under the darkness in search of a company where he would find it with Paola. Her corpse would later be found decapitated and severely burned to no recognition. Only 1 year later, and Francisco's cravings would kick back in, and he would end the life of a beggar who people referred to as Juan. Francisco went on to stab and crush the man's head using a large stone and knife. A few months later, a second beggar would be found seriously burned. Francisco would now commence his complete descension into madness as he would begin to commit acts of necrophilia on his victims' corpses and would at times eat parts of their bodies. Unsatisfied with the rate of murders he was able to commit, Francisco would sometimes opt out into simply heading into the local cemetery and digging up fresh corpses to defile. Taking a mixture of alcohol and tablets, Francisco was said to always show violent behavior and would even act out his mental hallucinations in the open. Francisco was quoted as stating that the voices in his head would laugh at him and indicated that they required blood, and so was the first time that he ate a piece of his victim's heart. 2 more unfortunate beggars would meet their death in 1989 at the hands of Francisco. Angel, as the locals called him, would be found decapitated with his fingerprints missing altogether. Not 2 months thereafter, another beggar known locally as Julio would be found dead, seriously stabbed with his penis completely severed off and placed within his mouth. In early 1990, Francisco would be readmitted into a psychiatric hospital after some minor run-ins with the law, but later escaped with a friend named Victor Luis. But not 2 days after their grand escape would police find Victor Luis dead, suffering from a crushed skull and severely burnt body, with Francisco being the prime suspect. After 5 years of the voices tormenting him and not being able to satisfy them with his murders, Francisco would go on to attempt to take his own life, and as such, he threw himself in front of a car, where he would only end up suffering a minor knee injury. At the hospital, Francisco would confess to the murders while asking the nurses to detain him. And as such, on April of 1994, Francisco would be sent off to court, where they would ultimately declare him criminally insane with a severe mental disorder caused by his alcoholism and his schizophrenia. Francisco would be confined into a psychiatric hospital with no possibility of release. He would stay there until his death in the Fontcalent prison and psychiatric center of Alacant, Spain, in August 19, 2014, of unknown causes at the old age of 66. Alright fam, that's it for this one. Stay safe and vigilant out there. And if you feel like supporting me, Abiopic, do so by liking, commenting, and subscribing.